Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Psych 4100 Cognitive Psychology for our lecture on Chapter 3, which covers perception. So now we're moving beyond the sort of introduction to cognitive psychology, which was Chapters 1, and an introduction to the brain, which was Chapter 2. And we're really starting to get into the meat and potatoes of cognitive psychology, which is what the brain does, right? The activities and function of the brain as they regard your sort of daily life. And so perception is all about, excuse me, your brain's sort of initial interpretation of the information that is coming into it from your senses. So some things that we're going to maybe consider or be able to consider after this chapter are questions like, why can two different people experience different perceptions in response to the same stimulus? This question hinges on the idea that your perception, your brain's interpretation of the information that comes in from your senses is just that. It's an interpretation. We can never be 100% certain about what is actually out there in the world, because by the time that information gets to our brain and then it sort of spits out an interpretation to us, it's an interpretation. We do not necessarily have a one-to-one correspondence between what you see or hear or feel and what's out there in the world. We're going to ask some questions about how perception depends upon a person's knowledge, their previous knowledge, and also the characteristics of the environment. How does the brain become tuned to respond to things that are likely to appear? So your brain starts to learn the typical patterns of the world, and it starts to tune itself to perceiving those types of patterns. And then how does perception relate to actions? So here's a great example of the difference between a stimulus and perception. This is a visual illusion known as apparent motion. So as your eyes sort of cascade across this image, you will see a sort of little bits of rotation in these sort of rings of color around these black dots, right? So if you just sort of let your eyes drift without too much control, you get little bits of rotation. You perceive movement. Your perception, your brain's interpretation of this image is that it's moving, even though it's not. This is not a GIF. This is a static, still image. There is no motion, but your brain interprets this stimulus as having motion, even when it doesn't. I can ask you the question, who is this a picture of? And most of us would pretty quickly correctly say that, well, this is an image of Abraham Lincoln. Now, it's not actually an image of Abraham Lincoln, right? It's these sort of colored blocks that are on a gray scale put in the relative orientation of a very famous sort of the textbook picture of Abraham Lincoln, right? You got his beard. This is the outline of his head, his sort of eyes. He's got a black suit on. That's this down here. So even though this is not actually a picture of Abraham Lincoln, you perceive it as one because you know what this picture looks like. You've seen it 100 times before on TV, in history books, on Wikipedia, right? Whatever. You've seen this picture so many times. Your previous knowledge of this picture is impacting your perception and your ability to say, yeah, actually, that is a picture of Abraham Lincoln. Even though technically it's not. It's just grayscaled colored blocks. Now, we could take this picture and probably go out into the world and find someone who is completely naive of Abraham Lincoln. So let's go into the Amazon jungle and find an isolated tribe that has had no contact with the outside world. We show them this picture, ask them, who is this? And they have no idea, obviously. because they don't have the top-down knowledge that you have of the sort of historical figure of Abraham Lincoln and the ubiquity of this particular image of him. So these very simple examples provide us evidence that, one, the nature of the stimulus will direct and control your perception. So the environment, the stimulus, can control your perception, and that the stimulus and your perception can differ. Your perception is not a one-to-one correspondence with the outside world. This example shows us that not only does the stimulus have an impact on our perception, but your previous knowledge has an impact on perception. Your understanding, your experiences impact your perceptions. And I also like this one really, it's a really nice example of, it's not quite a visual illusion, although there's some elements of visual illusion here. But if I asked you the question, what do you see? Most people respond, there's a white square. So we can see this white square. But in actuality, there is no white square. The white square doesn't exist. What are the objects here? Well, we have 4 little Pac-Man figures. Those are the actual objects. The white square is just the white background. But these 4 Pac-Man circles are aligned such that it creates this illusion of continuity, and thus you perceive these straight lines as forming a square, even though they don't. And one of the really cool parts of this visual illusion is that people report that the white of this square is a different color from the white of this background. So you probably perceive that as well. This square seems to pop out a little bit, and to me, it like almost looks more white than the background. But it's not. It is the same color, I promise you. And you even perceive like a little bit of a boundary right here, right? Like this boundary kind of pops out. Now I'm going to prove to you that this white is the same white as the background. What I want you to do is cover up, just with your hands, cover up the Pac-Man on the screen, right? Reach out, touch the screen, cover up all 4 of the Pac-Men, and you can see that the boundary disappears. Right? The boundary goes away as soon as you cover up the Pac-Man, because the boundary doesn't exist. The boundary is put there by your brain, even though it doesn't exist in the real world. So what I like to tell my students is that, in effect, your consciousness, lives in the matrix, and the matrix is created by your brain. Your brain is processing this incoming information, and it's doing its best to interpret it and then send along a signal to you for decision making in the world. But your brain is never sure 100% about what's out there in the world. It's guessing. And so sometimes it gets things wrong. Sometimes your brain says, oh, look, that's a white square, when it's not. Sometimes your brain says, ooh, look, those circles are moving, but they're not. Your brain is really good at producing this interpretation, but it's not perfect. And by the time that interpretation is made, it makes its way into your conscious awareness, you can't go back and undo it. You are beholden to your brain's interpretation, just like, you know, all of the humans were beholden to the machines when they're tapped into the matrix. There's nothing you can do about it. Okay, so now that we've illustrated those examples a little bit, let's define what perception is. Perception, very simply, is your experience, your conscious experience that results from stimulation of your senses. So some of the basic concepts that we need to understand about perception is that perceptions can change based on additional information, right? Perceptions involve a process that in many ways is similar to reasoning or problem solving, except your brain is doing it on its own. And perceptions occur in conjunction with action. There's the sort of reciprocal relationship between perception and action. Now, because perception is dependent upon your senses, and because our senses and the senses of different animals differ from animal to animal, it's very possible that human perceptual processes are unique to humans, both in the animal world and, as we're going to see, perhaps arguably in the technological world in terms of artificial intelligence. Because these attempts to create artificial forms of perception and intelligence often have limited success. They can be successful in very particular domains, but it's very difficult to reproduce human perception, even with incredible, amazing computing power and processing power. Just think about self-driving cars, which are great and are incredibly safe. They are much safer than humans driving. But they're still not as good as humans are at perception. They're safer. The AI self-driving cars are safer because the machine doesn't do stupid stuff. It doesn't drink and drive, right? It doesn't answer its phone. It doesn't turn around to look at its kids in the back seat and yell at them and then get into an accident. The machine pays attention to what it's doing, to the road and driving. But they still make mistakes, right? They still miss a pedestrian that's in the crosswalk and hit them. They still miss a jackknifed car in the road and cause an accident. So these machines, while can become very good at human-like perception, often never quite get there perfectly. Now, we do want to create a distinction between sensation and perception. Sensation really is physiological. It's just the study of the environmental stimulus impacting your senses. So, for example, if we're studying vision, then sensation is the light that enters your eyes and hits the back of your retina, and it registers with your brain. That's a sensation. It's just the physical stimulus. A perception is sort of the next level up, which is more psychological because it involves an interpretation of this physical stimulus, and it involves your brain applying some kind of organizational and interpretation sort of systems or structure to that information, such that we're not really talking about the light hitting your retina anymore. We're talking about the fact that you see a horse. So seeing the horse that's outside your window is a perception. The light that's bouncing off of that horse and then hitting your retina is sensation. So sensation, physiological; perception, psychological. So first off, to start learning the building blocks of perception in humans, let's talk about why machines are typically not as good as humans at doing this sort of task of perception. So the first difficulty is known as the inverse projection problem. So what this refers to is the fact that when light hits your retina, that light could come from multiple different things, objects out in the world, but cast the same light onto your retina. So your brain has to try, and using things like previous experience and context, it has to try and interpret that information. So let's look at what that looks like, because when light hits the back of your eye, which is your retina, what ends up happening is that literally an inverse image is created on the back of your retina. Things from sort of the bottom, right? Because light moves in a straight line. Things from the bottom will hit the top of your retina. Things in the world from the top will hit the bottom of your retina. So the retinal image is always inverted from what's actually out there in the world. So what your brain has to do is flip it back the right way. And that involves an element of interpretation. Your brain is now moving beyond the stimulus, and it's trying to interpret this upside down stimulus so that it can feed you an upright perception. And furthermore, sorry, this is just like a touch blurry. Furthermore, that image on the back of your retina, let's say you look at a square, right? You perceive a square. And so this square in the world casts this particular image on your retina. Well, the problem is that this retinal image could also come from a slightly larger square that's a little further away and tilted backwards. If any of you are like really into particle physics, right, we could do the math on this. I'm not going to do the math, but we could do the math on this that this corner, right, will cast the same piece of reflected light onto your retina as this corner. This corner will cast the same piece of reflected light as this corner. So literally, based just on retinal image, your brain should be unable to distinguish between this upright, close square, this larger, tilted, but slightly further away square, and this even larger, tilted, and more slightly more further away square. All three of these objects, even though they are different objects in the world, would mathematically cast the same retinal image onto the back of your eye, meaning that your brain should not be able to tell the difference between them. Your brain does. It does its best. It's going to make mistakes sometimes, but your brain uses things like context and previous experience to try and figure out which of these things is the real thing that's out there in the world. The problem is a machine has a lot of difficulty doing that. The machine has trouble using that context. And we have trouble coding that context, giving the context to the machine. So in a situation like this, machines will get very confused and they'll do it wrong. An analogy for how this is happening is shadow puppets, actually. So think of the shadow up here, which is a hand. That is the retinal image, right? That's being cast on the wall. But that image could be created by many, many objects in the world. This could be, I don't know, a tree that we have like sculpted to like exactly cast this shadow. Or maybe a hedge, like a bush, right? You could have a big hedge in front of someone's house and you could perfectly cut this into it such that it's not actually a hand, but it casts that image onto your retina. Or we could manipulate some object in the world like this rabbit such that it looks like the rabbit, or so that we have an actual rabbit, but the image that it's casting on your retina, it looks like a hand, even though this thing is not actually a hand. So your brain is working off of this shadow, trying to interpret what the heck is causing this shadow that's actually out in the world. And sometimes your brain gets it wrong, but a lot of times machines get it wrong. They're getting better, but they're still not perfect. A second major reason that machines, two more major reasons why machines have trouble with perception. The first is viewpoint invariance, meaning that when you and I see or perceive a chair, we sort of understand that, there are basically an infinite number of orientations that this chair could take. So if you imagine this chair sitting in the middle of a room, you could walk around it 360 degrees, and the chair is casting a different image on your retina every time you take a step, right? Every movement causes the chair to be at a slightly different angle and thus to cast a slightly different shadow onto your retina. But you and I are still perfectly capable of having an invariant perception that this thing is a chair. We don't suddenly get confused because the chair turns and we go, oh, I don't know what the hell that is anymore, right? That doesn't happen. As we change the angle of the chair, it doesn't change our understanding that it's a chair. It doesn't change our perception that it's a chair. So if we were going to program a machine, then you would have to like program every possible orientation and tag every possible orientation for the computer that hey, that thing's a chair. And oh, by the way, this thing is a chair. And oh, by the way, this thing is a chair too, even though they look completely different. And even though they cast wildly different images onto the back of a retina. And lastly, scenes are super complicated, right? We'll take the example again of a self-driving car. This self-driving car has an unbelievable amount of information to try and take in. It has to take in the sort of just the basic structure of the road and the lanes, how wide things are. Is this a double line or a dotted line? It's, of course, perceiving the other vehicles and making changes based upon what those vehicles do. It's trying to perceive perhaps things like street lights or stop signs. It's looking at trying to understand the movement of pedestrians. And in this constant, dynamic, changing, coordinated way, as the car, by the way, moves on its own itself. And so this insane complexity of information can become very difficult for machines to handle. And just add in, right, viewpoint invariance. So as this car moves, right, as we maybe change lanes, the image of everything else in the environment changes. Because now everything is at a different angle. But you still have to try and perceive those things as the same thing that they were before, right? So this car, this green car ahead of us, is still the same car even after we change lanes, even though the sort of retinal image changes, right? The angle of the car is here, it's angle 1. And if I move to the right 1 lane, now I have a different angle, angle 2. The retinal image has changed, but we still need to perceive this as being the same car. And so it's just computationally a ton of information. It's just there's a lot of stuff going on, and it can be difficult to get a computer to do it, which is what makes your brain quite remarkable, because your brain manages to do all of this pretty much seamlessly 99.9% of the time. You don't even notice it. You don't have to even think about that. Oh, if we change our angle, then my perception changes, or the stimulus changes of the light coming from this car. I need to redirect and no, you don't have to do any of that. Your brain automatically does it. So there are 2 sort of information systems that we use in human perception. The first is the environment. It's the data coming into our senses. That's known as bottom-up information or bottom-up processing. It's just your brain processing the data that it gets from the world. And that data will drive perception, will change perception. But as we saw with Abraham Lincoln, there's a separate process. We call this top-down. This is the application of your conceptual knowledge, your expectations, your experiences to the data. Right? What do you expect to see in this scenario? And that's going to drive your perception. So we don't want to think of these as competing forces, bottom up and top down. We want to think of them as sort of meeting in the middle to become reciprocal sources of information that is used. And when they meet in the middle, that's what perception is. It's the meeting in the middle of the data from the environment being combined with the information you already have stored in your brain, your knowledge, your experience, your expectations, and the context. So all of this meets in the middle, and that's where perception happens. So again, just like Abraham Lincoln, let's break down the bottom-up versus the top-down processes here. So I'll give you a second to think about it. If I asked you, what is the bottom-up nature of this stimulus versus what is the top-down nature of this stimulus? Well, the bottom-up is, remember, is the data. So the bottom-up is your brain's ability to perceive basically the arrangement, orientation, and color of all of these pixels. Just your brain goes, oh, that one is darker than that one, and they're both darker than that one. But this area is the lightest, and these are all basically uniform and regular pixel squares. Like just your brain doing the math of perceiving these pixels. That's bottom up. Top down is that knowledge that you carry with you that this is Abraham Lincoln, who he was, what he looked like, and the fact that you've seen this famous image before. So there are sort of two ways that we can approach studying perception. We can engage in theories of direct perception, which focus on the bottom-up processing, or we can have constructive perception theories, which focus a little bit more on the top-down processing. Neither is necessarily right or neither is necessarily wrong, because we need them both. But different theories of perception will maybe focus more or less on top-down versus bottom-up processing. So you can think about this, a pyramid is not a bad analogy, right? The base of the pyramid is the environment. If you don't have any data coming in from the environment, you don't have a real perception. Interestingly, if anyone's ever heard of something called a stimulus deprivation tank or stimulus deprivation chamber, they're these chambers, typically a water tank, where the water is kept exactly at body temperature. It's a saline saltwater solution, so you float. You get it. People use these tanks for like meditation, like recovery, things like that, relaxation, and they're typically put in a room that is ideally completely void of noise. It's been soundproofed. There's as little light as possible, no lights in there. You go, you lay down in your float tank, you float, and so after a while, your body starts to acclimate to the temperature of the water and the fact that you're floating, and there's no sound and there's no light. Basically, there's no environment as far as your senses are concerned. There's no data coming in. There's no input, or there's very, very, very little input. And so what ends up happening is sometimes people like hallucinate as if they're on like LSD or something, because the brain can't handle this lack of input. It has to create its own input. So you begin to perceive things that aren't real. So this foundation of data from the environment gets combined with sort of the higher order top of the pyramid here, which is you and your brain, meaning your experiences, right? And your brain holds all of that information, right? You and your brain working together to sort of have experiences and knowledge and concepts and memories, things like that. Now, another lovely illustration of this sort of reciprocal relationship between top-down and bottom-up processing. This is a very famous study where cognitive psychologists showed people these sort of blurry images, and they asked people to identify the objects that are circled, the circled objects. So let's look at this image, image B, and the circled object. If I asked you what that was, you would probably say something like a drink, a bottle, maybe a mug, a cup, right? A water bottle, something like that. If I asked you what this circled object was, basically everyone is going to say a foot or a shoe, right? Let's go to image D. If I asked you what this object is, most people are going to say something like a vehicle, right? A car. And if I asked you what this object is, there's a couple options here. Think about which one you would say, but I would go like, a fire hydrant, like a post. Maybe it's a person, or it's kind of, because it's all blurry, it's difficult to tell, the sort of distances here. But this is like some object that's, cylindrical and vertical, right? A post, a fire hydrant, maybe a person, something like that. Well, turns out that each of these, what they called blobs, is the same blob. They took this blob, right? This nothing. If we look at the image labeled blob, it's nothing. It's kind of like a dark, squiggly line sort of thing with gray around it. It's a blob. But if you take that blob and you Photoshop it into different scenes, right? That's what these are. B, C, and D are different scenes. Here we have people, like, I don't know, sitting at a table or sitting in a living room. Here we have a man, it looks like at a store, maybe probably the grocery store or the pharmacy. And here is a street scene. When we take this identical blob and we put it in different scenes, in these contexts, the blob takes on new meaning. Because the context provides sort of information about what we should be expecting the blob to be. So in scene B, it would be unreasonable to say that this blob is a shoe. It could be, right? It is perfectly possible for this dude in the blue shirt to take off his shoe and put it on the table like this. Right? He could do it. It's just not typical of this context. What's typical of this context is that this is a bottle, right? Or a glass or a mug. So if we move to the grocery store context, then this is clearly a shoe or a foot. It's not a bottle, even though it could be a bottle, right? Like this guy's foot could be behind this bottle that's laying on the floor. That's possible, but we don't interpret it that way. We don't perceive it that way because it's not what we expect from this context. We expect this to be a shoe or a foot. So we have now this combination of the data of the blob, right? Its orientation, its color, its shading. We have the data of the context, and then we have our top-down interpretation, knowledge, and expectations of the context and what each of these objects should be in that context. And those things meet in the middle, and that's where you get perception. So we see this a lot, right? In the news, every so often somebody finds, a piece of toast with the Virgin Mary on it. It's not the Virgin Mary. You don't see the Virgin Mary. It's a piece of toast. But it's a piece of toast that, kind of looks like a face, right? Like, here's the outline of a face. Here's a forehead. We've got like eyes. I mean, this could be like hair, right? Or like a hood. Got a little nose, a little mouth, chin down here. If you look at this piece of toast, you perceive a face. The face pops out at you, even though it's not a face. It's just a damn piece of toast that just happened to randomly toast in this pattern. But you undoubtedly see a face. You perceive a face. The reason that people tend to see faces in things is because face processing is incredibly relevant evolutionarily. Humans evolved as a social species, and the most social thing is someone else's face. And that face carries information: who they are, how old they are, what gender are they, do I know them or not, what emotions are they displaying. There's faces come with unbelievably rich amounts of information that we use every day to make decisions. So if you saw someone's face and you recognize that that is an unfamiliar man and they're very, very angry, should you go, like, say hi and introduce yourself and shake their hand to this angry, unfamiliar male? Probably not. That's pretty damn dangerous. So you don't do it, right? You avoid, you go the other way, because this face is a rich arena of information. And so we have evolved dedicated processing for faces. We mentioned it in the lecture on chapter 2 with prosopagnosia and face processing. You have a little piece of your brain that all it does is look for and process faces, because faces are evolutionarily relevant. And so we tend to over perceive faces. For example, this cut green pepper looks like it has a face on the inside of it. This mailbox looks like a face smoking a cigarette. This cup of coffee looks like it's smiling at you. And then this building, this is my favorite one, I think, looks like a face, as does the indentation from this little seatbelt part. Right? So you undoubtedly perceive faces here, even though these aren't even like mimicking human faces. They just mimic the geometric arrangement of facial features, right? So what does your brain actually look for when it looks for a face? It looks for two circular small things about even with each other that are above a sort of more long, thin, open thing at the bottom or something like that, right? That's sort of the coordinates of a face as far as your brain is concerned. And when it sees objects that match those coordinates, it goes, ooh, face, ooh, face, ooh, face. And that's why you perceive faces everywhere. Another really interesting place where top-down processing influences our perception is in speech and language. It's very easy in perception to talk exclusively about vision, but in fact, hearing, audition, and language are incredibly important spaces, obviously, for perception and interpretation. So your brain has to solve what's known as the speech segmentation problem. It's your ability to tell where one word ends and another word begins. So, for example, let's focus on the word framed. The picture is framed. Focus on the word framed. Versus the sentence, it already has a frame, duh. Right? It already has a frame, duh. Or the frame doesn't fit. So in these three cases, framed, 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 right? We get the same noise. Framed, framed, framed isn't fit. We get this frame noise with a D, and the noise that you hear is identical. Framed, framed, framed. So what your brain has to do is, using the context of the sentence and using your prior experience with language, it has to figure out which of these three options is happening in the world. Is it the word framed? Is it the word frame followed by the expression duh? Or is it the word frame followed by a word that starts with D? Framed, framed, framed doesn't, right? It's tough. That's why things like Google Translate get things wrong all the time, right? Imagine trying to teach a computer the difference between these things. It's really difficult. So those translation apps and translation programs get this stuff wrong. But your brain doesn't. Your brain figures it out because of your top-down processing, your experiences and your understanding of the language. Your brain also uses things called transitional probabilities. So as you learn a language, you start to figure out which noises sort of go with other noises. So in English, the sound sh, made commonly by sh. Also, by the way, sorry, in linguistics, when you see these slashes with letters in between them, what the slashes indicate is that we're not talking about the letters, we're talking about the sound. So sh. So the sound sh is more likely to be followed by a vowel like o or e or oo, right? Like shout or sheet or shut. And it's much, much less likely to be followed by a consonant sound like K, P, or Even though it can be followed by these sounds, it is more typically followed by a vowel sound. And so your brain starts to learn the probabilities of the English language and the co-occurrence of noises, and it uses those learned probabilities to help you interpret language out in the world. Your brain also uses what's known as the likelihood principle in interpreting language. So we often perceive the world in a way that it is most likely to be, right, based on our past experiences, the most likely outcome. I want you to imagine that someone is saying this sentence to you. I bought my dog at a shop. I bought my dog at a shop. Something happens when they say this word. Maybe a car horn blasts, or someone opens a window or opens a door or slams a door. There's some noise that obscures this word, so you don't actually hear it. But given this sentence, I bought my dog at a shop, which of these is most likely to be the missing word? Sweat or pet? I bought my dog at a sweatshop, or I bought my dog at a pet shop. Clearly, our past experience and our understanding of the English language, using the likelihood principle, will tell us that even though we didn't hear the word pet, that is the most likely word to be in this blank. And so that's how we should perceive it, even though you didn't technically hear the word pet. And we can also take this idea of the likelihood principle and combine it with something that's called unconscious inference. This was an idea by an early perceptual psychologist named Helmholtz. So this also kind of plays on the idea of retinal image and viewpoint invariance. But I want you to imagine here, let's look at image A. This is what you see. This retinal image of this blue rectangle and this red shape. This is the retinal image on your eye, and this is what your brain has to work with to interpret. Given your past experience, it is more likely that B is the case than is C, right? So your brain is trying to figure out what is out there in the world. Here's the retinal image. I need to interpret the retinal image, and your brain is going to be much more likely to interpret it as B, which is a blue rectangle in the foreground that is occluding a part of a orange, I guess that's orange or red rectangle that's behind it, right? The blue rectangle is occluding, is covering up part of the orange or red rectangle. that's much more likely the source of this retinal image than is the fact that you would have a blue rectangle that fits perfectly in the cutout of this six-sided red figure, right? That's not likely. How often is that going to happen in the world, right? Not very often. C would be an incredibly rare occurrence in the natural world. But B is a very common occurrence in the world. You walk around right now, just literally look at anything around you, and there's something behind it. And so the thing that's in front is occluding the thing that's behind. But your brain figures it out because it makes this assumption, right? This likelihood assumption. It is an unconscious inference. Your brain is inferring that what this really is two objects, one of which is occluding another one. Okay, that's a nice place to stop for part 1 of chapter 3. We will pick this up with part 2 and finish the lecture with a discussion of perceptual organization. So thanks, everybody. Hop into part 2 as soon as you're ready, and I will talk to you later.